Karoline Leavitt thought it was just a joke, until the man she mocked stood up and changed everything. In a town hall meant for politics, what unfolded was something deeper, a quiet masterclass in dignity, marriage, and the kind of strength you don't see on cable news. Karoline Leavitt came with cameras and sound bites, but when she took aim at Jasmine Crockett's husband, she didn't expect him to respond. And definitely not like this. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stood up, and in under 3 minutes, he silenced a room full of people and changed the conversation across the country. If you believe real strength isn't always loud and respect still matters in America, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what does strength look like to you? Because what happened next, no one was ready for. It wasn't supposed to be historic. It was just a Wednesday. Just a local civic forum in a modest community center off Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place where coffee percolates in stained carafes in the back corner, and the folding chairs squeak more than they support. It was the kind of event where most people came for a handshake, a flyer, maybe to snap a selfie with a local politician. But not that night. Because that night, something shifted. Karoline Leavitt flew in that afternoon. She wasn't the main speaker, but her name carried weight. Enough weight to draw local cameras, a buzz of supporters, and that distinct whiff of staged spontaneity. Her team set up a small digital backdrop near the door, hashtag signage, bright ring lights, a stack of branded handouts that were still warm from the print shop. She entered the room like someone entering a courtroom where she already expected to win, confident, composed, calculated. Jasmine Crockett arrived through the side entrance, quietly, no entourage, no flash. Just her and her husband Terence, walking 2 steps behind, sipping coffee from a paper cup. He wore a simple navy blazer, beige slacks, no tie. The kind of man who blended in by choice. They didn't walk in with power, but with presence. Jasmine took her seat near the front. Terence slipped into the 4th row. He didn't look around the room, didn't adjust his posture to make himself bigger. He just sat, comfortable in stillness. The crowd was a mixed bag. Retired teachers with lapel pins, a few college students scribbling notes, clearly there for extra credit, local activists, elderly couples who came out of habit more than interest. There was an energy in the room, but it wasn't excitement. It was anticipation, the kind that lives in the seconds before a thunderstorm. People didn't know what they were about to witness, but they could feel it was something. They didn't know why their eyes kept drifting toward the podium or why the folding chairs felt tighter than usual. Preston Riley, the moderator, took the stage. He was a local journalist, sharp, careful, used to playing referee without choosing sides. He opened with a brief speech about civic duty, bipartisanship, the importance of hearing from both sides. Standard stuff. But he kept looking down at his cue cards, like he already sensed this wouldn't go the way it was planned. The first few minutes were uneventful. Jasmine spoke first, briefly, clearly, on family policies, childcare, paid leave. She had the facts. But more than that, she had that tone, the one that came from someone who wasn't there to impress, but to inform. Her voice didn't rise or falter. It carried. Terence watched her like he always did, not adoringly, not dutifully, but with that rare blend of pride and partnership, the way you look at someone when you've seen them fight private wars in public arenas and still come home to fold laundry and ask about your mother. Karoline spoke next. She started smooth, pulled from her usual bag of sound bites, crime statistics, family decay, the importance of traditional values. Her audience clapped in the right places. She nodded in rhythm, like a conductor leading an orchestra of pre-approved applause. But something in her cadence changed when she glanced across the room and saw Jasmine. There was something about Jasmine's stillness, how she didn't respond, didn't fidget, didn't react. That kind of poise sometimes unsettles people who thrive on disruption. Karoline leaned into the mic a little more, started talking about strong families, how conservative values built discipline, stability, honor. She didn't name names, not at first, but every sentence came with an unspoken underline. Then the smirk came. That slow, practiced expression designed to look spontaneous. Karoline rested both hands on the podium and said, "I just find it a little ironic how some politicians love to get up here and preach about strong families, but their own husbands look like they wouldn't know strength if it handed them a toolbox. What's his name? Terrell? Terence? Seems like the kind of guy who lets his wife wear the pants, and the belt, and probably the shoes too. The crowd didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. A few chuckled reflexively. Preston Riley blinked, unsure whether to cut in or let the moment hang. Jasmine didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But in the fourth row, Terence looked down at his hands. Not hurt, not ashamed, just aware. Aware that a line had been crossed, not just by Karoline's words, but by the silence that followed. Aware that sometimes a man's dignity is measured not by how loud he claps back, but by whether he's willing to stand when it's easier to sit. And in that quiet space, between the insult and the reaction, something stirred. Not rage, not defensiveness, something older, something deeper. The kind of resolve that doesn't come from ego, but from a lifetime of knowing exactly who you are, even when the world tries to tell you different. Terence shifted slightly in his seat, rolled his shoulders back, looked straight ahead. Then, without saying a word, he stood. And that's when everything changed. The sound of Terence's chair scraping against the tiled floor was small, nearly swallowed by the murmurs that followed Karoline's jab. But it echoed in all the right places, through the camera lenses now focusing in tighter, through the nerves of the moderator trying to hold the night together, and most importantly, through the hearts of everyone in the room who knew what they had just heard. Karoline Leavitt hadn't just taken a political jab. She had crossed a line, a personal one, the kind that doesn't vanish when the topic changes. And Terence Crockett had just chosen to answer, not with fury, but with presence. Karoline watched him rise, arms still locked on the podium, her fingers tapping the edge like she was trying to decide whether to double down or shift gears. Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but she forced it back into place. The crowd's attention was no longer on her. It was on him. This wasn't the script she'd walked in with, and that realization was beginning to show. Terence didn't rush. Every step he took toward the front of the room was measured, like he was carrying something fragile that couldn't be dropped. Not anger, not pride, something heavier, something more sacred. As he passed the second row, a man in a VFW hat tilted his head and watched him closely. A retired teacher reached for her glasses. A young mother in the back sat her phone down without hitting record, not wanting to interrupt the moment even with a swipe. Jasmine turned her head just slightly, tracking him with her eyes, but she didn't move to stop him. She knew that look on his face, not performative, not reactive, but purposeful. She had seen that same expression when he spoke at their niece's graduation, when he told his mother she didn't have to move into assisted living, when he sat beside her in silence after her first failed election. It was his "let me do this" face. Karoline gave a chuckle, trying to maintain control of the room. "Sir, this isn't the Q&A portion. Please take your seat." Her voice was still wrapped in poise, but the nerves behind it weren't hard to hear. She was used to confrontation, but not this kind. Not a confrontation that didn't shout. One that didn't give her something to parry or punch. Just a man, quiet and deliberate, walking toward her. Terence stopped about 10 feet from the stage. He didn't take the mic. He didn't ask for permission. He just turned to face her and spoke. "I heard what you said," he began. The room went still. There was no mic, yet somehow his voice reached the back without strain. It wasn't volume, it was clarity. "You brought me up. Not my wife, not her policy, not even your political disagreement. Me. You chose to drag a private man into a public room for a cheap punchline, so now I'm standing here, and you're going to listen." The breath that left the room was audible. Preston Riley opened his mouth, unsure whether to interject, but the crowd wasn't with him. They were locked in, every eye facing front, every body leaning forward. Karoline gave a tight smile. "I didn't mean anything personal, sir. It was a joke, a light one. You're a public figure now, after all. Technically." Terence tilted his head. "No, ma'am," he said, the calm in his voice almost unnerving. "I'm not a public figure. I'm a private man who married a public woman. I don't need headlines or cameras. I don't need to trend. I show up when she asks me to." I hold her hand when she walks out of rooms like this, and I don't speak when the attacks are about politics. But when you make it personal, when you stand behind a podium and decide that a black man sitting in silence must be weak, then silence becomes permission, and I will not give you that. The room held its breath. Even the HVAC system seemed quieter. He turned slightly toward the crowd. You know, I've never liked these kinds of forums, not because I'm not proud of my wife. I am. But because they're built for performance, built to see who can land the sharpest line, who can twist the deepest. And in that performance, something gets lost. Humanity. Respect. Karoline crossed her arms. Is this a speech about masculinity now? She asked, a smirk returning with effort. Terence didn't rise to it. He nodded slowly. No, this isn't about gender roles. This is about something much simpler. This is about how we treat each other. About how we respect someone's family, someone's home, someone's name. He looked at her directly again. I don't need to match your energy to prove my worth. I don't need to fire back to remind people that I'm here. You mock me because I sit quietly, because I don't bark when someone throws shade. But let me ask you this. What if strength looks like patience? What if support isn't loud? What if a man's love for his wife is best shown by letting her be the fire while he keeps the house steady? A low murmur spread through the back. Some heads nodded. A few mouths opened to speak, then closed again. Nobody wanted to interrupt what felt like the first real moment of the night. Terence's gaze softened, just slightly. We don't do this for applause. We do this because it's right, because our daughters are watching, because our sons are listening, because the world doesn't need another man performing masculinity like it's theater. It needs men who mean what they say, who lift without limelight, and who never need a podium to prove their standing. Silence. He looked over at Jasmine then. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with that knowing, glowing stillness of someone who just watched someone else say the thing they've both felt for years, but never spoken aloud. Terence turned back to Karoline. You wanted a laugh, but what you got was a line in the sand, and it won't be redrawn tonight. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't look to the crowd for validation. He turned, walked calmly back to his seat, and sat exactly as he had been, hands folded, back straight. And as he did, something shifted, not just in the room, but in every person who had heard him. Because words that come from truth don't need echo. They make their own. The moment Terence sat back down, it felt like someone had knocked the air out of the room, but gently, like a father telling a bedtime story that ended in a truth everyone needed to hear. The crowd was still, not stunned like they had witnessed a blow-up, but quiet in the way you get when you've seen something honest, something that doesn't beg to be clapped for, but demands to be remembered. For a few long seconds, even the lights felt different, less artificial, more like sunlight after rain. Jasmine hadn't moved. Her eyes never left her husband's back, and her fingers were still wrapped around her water bottle, but her grip had softened. She wasn't bracing anymore. She was rooted. Across the room, a middle-aged woman reached into her purse for tissues. A young man in the back, one who'd been scrolling on his phone earlier, had it screened down on his lap now. Everyone was looking, not just at Terence, but at what he represented. Karoline Leavitt blinked, just once, then twice. Her hands were still on the podium, but her fingers were no longer tapping. Her posture straightened slightly, as though trying to recall the script she had walked in with. But something was missing. The wind, the rhythm, that inner drumbeat that made every line land like a headline. It was gone, and she knew it. Well, she said finally, her voice pitched lighter than before, that was heartfelt. She smiled, tight and unmoving. But I'm not here to debate personal dynamics. I'm here to talk about the facts, the policies that matter to real American families. She launched into statistics, quoting percentages about crime and education, but her voice bounced off the crowd like pebbles on a lake that had already frozen. Nobody interrupted, nobody cheered. The words landed, but they didn't settle. Because she was no longer the center of the room, Terence was. And not because he'd taken it, because the room had offered it. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, signaling that she would speak next. The moderator, Preston Riley, looked visibly relieved. He nodded. Congresswoman Crockett, would you care to respond? She took her time, let the pause stretch out, not to create suspense, but to let the moment breathe. Then she adjusted her mic and said, I think everything that needed to be said tonight has already been said. A quiet chuckle of acknowledgement rolled through the rows. Not laughter, recognition. But, she added, since we're here, let's talk about real family values. The phrase wasn't shouted. It wasn't weaponized. It was placed like a stone in the foundation of something deeper. Not the ones you put on mailers or speeches or campaign slogans, Jasmine continued. I mean the kind that show up when nobody's watching, the kind that don't need defending because they already live in the way we treat each other. She glanced toward Terence. He didn't look back this time. He didn't need to. My husband didn't come here to make a statement. He came because I asked him to, because I needed one person in the room who would see me, not as a congresswoman, not as a headline, not as someone to be interrupted, but just as a woman doing her job. And when he stood, it wasn't because I needed protection, it's because he knew I deserved respect. The room shifted again, not in volume, but in weight. You could feel it in your chest, like a song you didn't expect to love, but suddenly couldn't stop humming. We talk a lot about leadership in politics, Jasmine continued, about who's strong enough, who's bold enough, who can take the heat. But sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who says the fewest words. Sometimes, the boldest thing you can do is stay seated, until the moment you're not supposed to anymore. Karoline tried to interrupt, but Preston placed a hand gently on the desk mic and shook his head. Let her finish. Jasmine did. That's what partnership looks like, she said. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's real, and it lasts, because the person you build a life with should never be a punchline. They should be your piece. She sat back. There was no applause cue, no standing ovation, just silence, full, reverent, unforgettable silence. Then a hand rose from the middle of the room. A woman in her 60s, gray hair tied in a low bun, stood slowly. I don't have a question, she said. I just want to say, that was the first time I've heard a man speak like that in a room like this. And it mattered. To all of us who've been holding it together quietly while the world shouted around us, it mattered. The first claps came from her row, then another, then the back, not raucous, not thunderous, but steady, like rain starting on a roof. Karoline's face didn't twitch, but she didn't speak again, not for a while. That night, the live stream's comment section flooded with quotes, not from policy, not from campaign promises, but from Terence, from Jasmine, from that moment where a man stood up, not for applause, not for show, but because someone had to say it. Respect still matters. And in that truth, the entire room, whether they voted left, right, or not at all, finally agreed on something. By the next morning, what had happened inside that modest community center in Columbus was everywhere. Not on the front page of the New York Times, not on the chyrons of major cable networks, yet it started smaller, quieter. A teacher posted the clip to Facebook with a caption, "Every young man needs to hear this." A nurse tweeted it with the words, "Strength isn't volume, it's stillness." A pastor in Kentucky shared the clip with his Wednesday Bible study group and said, "Play this at home, watch it twice." And then it caught fire. By lunchtime, local affiliates were looping the footage of Terence standing up, but they weren't showing it like a gotcha moment. They weren't analyzing it like a scandal. They were letting it play, in full. No cuts, no commentary. Just a man, standing up and saying what needed to be said, and sitting back down again. Viewers didn't need spin. They needed space to feel it. In the following 24 hours, the video had over 4 million views. Karoline didn't address it, not directly. Her campaign team issued a statement saying she was committed to real conversations about family values and freedom. It didn't land. The comments beneath the post weren't angry. They were tired. Tired of seeing dignity reduced to debate points. Tired of watching people who speak plainly and lovingly be made into spectacles. Tired of mistaking cruelty for strength. Back in Columbus, Jasmine returned to her work as if nothing had happened. She held constituent meetings. She visited a daycare center. She hosted a workshop on small business access. But the way people greeted her had shifted. There was something softer, something deeper. A woman in line at the post office whispered, "My husband sent me that clip. We talked for 3 hours after. Thank you." Terence went back to his quiet life, too. He ran the register at his hardware store. He showed up at his nephew's track meet. He watered the roses his mother planted before she passed. And the neighbors, who'd known him for years but never quite looked twice, now nodded when he walked by. Not because he was famous, because he had reminded them of something they hadn't seen in a while, a man who shows up without a script. On the Sunday after the forum, Jasmine and Terence sat side by side at church. Nothing flashy, just a wooden pew, a quiet prayer, and a familiar hymn that had soothed them both since childhood. The pastor paused before his sermon. He looked down at Terence. "Brother Crockett," he said, "you walked into that hall and reminded us all what Scripture teaches without quoting a single verse. That was faith in motion." That night, Jasmine made dinner: cornbread, collard greens, and baked chicken, Terence's favorite. They sat across from each other and didn't talk much. They didn't need to. But just before he reached for seconds, Terence said, "You know I didn't plan that, right?" Jasmine looked up. "I know. I wasn't trying to be anything. I couldn't let her make you small. I couldn't let them laugh and think I was fine with it." She nodded. That's why it mattered. And it wasn't just them who felt it. Across the country, emails poured into Jasmine's office. Not political ones, not from donors, from husbands who said, "I didn't know I was allowed to be quiet." From wives who said, "I want that kind of love." From sons who said, "I watched this with my dad." Respect had been redefined, not with policy, not with a debate, but with a moment that caught the nation off guard. Because in that room in Columbus, when Terence stood up, he didn't just speak. He recalibrated the noise. He reminded people that there is a power in showing up with calm, with conviction, and with love that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And that reminder didn't just touch the audience that night. It moved through living rooms and dinner tables, office break rooms, and Sunday services. It told people that maybe, just maybe, the loudest person in the room isn't the one worth listening to. Sometimes the real strength sits 4 rows back until it stands. A week later, the headlines had moved on. New controversies, new outrage, new clips that shouted instead of whispered. But in quiet homes, in hushed conversations, in those slow kitchen table moments where real life is lived, Terence's words still lingered. Not because he was famous now, he wasn't. Not because he gave interviews, he didn't. But because something in the way he spoke, in the way he stood without needing to take anything, stayed with people. In their own neighborhood, people began showing up differently. A high school football coach started leaving notes for his players with words like patience, presence, character. A city council member in Dayton referenced Terence during a speech about community healing, saying that maybe it's time we honored those who support, not just those who shout. A barbershop downtown played the video on a loop one Saturday afternoon, and it sparked a 2-hour discussion that ended not in arguments, but in nods. Terence never responded to the thousands of messages directly. He kept showing up at work. He fixed the busted faucet in the church basement. He helped a neighbor patch their fence. But every once in a while, someone would walk into his store and say, "I saw it, thank you." And he would smile, soft and unassuming, and say, "Just doing what needed doing." One night, long after the house was quiet, Jasmine found him in the garage, tinkering with an old lamp that had been broken for years. She leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "You know you changed the conversation, right?" she said. Terence didn't look up right away. He tightened a screw and then set the wrench down. "I wasn't trying to change anything, just didn't want to stay silent when it mattered." She stepped closer. "Well, you did. You reminded people what partnership looks like, what a good man looks like, without having to raise your voice or your fists." He wiped his hands on an old rag. "I didn't think anyone was listening." "They were," she said. "They still are." Months passed. The clip became one of those pieces of media that educators bookmarked, that pastors referenced in sermons, that dads showed their teenage sons. It didn't fade. It rooted itself into the cultural soil, quiet but enduring. the kind of story that surfaces in moments when dignity is needed most. One spring, Jasmine was invited to speak at a national leadership summit. She delivered her remarks clearly, passionately, professionally, as always. But during the Q&A, a woman stood up and asked, "How do you define strength?" Jasmine paused. She smiled. "That's easy," she said. "Strength is what my husband showed in that room. It's calm in the storm. It's grace under fire. It's knowing who you are and not needing anyone to clap for it." The crowd applauded. Back in Ohio, Terence was in the backyard planting tomatoes. He didn't know she said that. He didn't need to, because for him, strength wasn't about moments. It was about consistency. It was about carrying someone else's weight without turning it into a performance. It was about loving in the quiet, showing up in the hard times, and knowing that when you finally do speak, it means something. And maybe that's why the world listened. So if you're watching this right now, ask yourself, who in your life needs someone to stand up for them? Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the kind of love that knows when silence becomes permission and chooses to speak. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is sit quietly in the fourth row until it's time to stand. Franklin didn't waste time with ceremony. As soon as the words, "I'm Franklin Rhodes, retired federal judge," left his mouth, the dynamic in the hallway changed. It wasn't just the titles. It was the way he carried them, calm, precise, unmoved. You could feel the shift, the way the agents subtly straightened, the way one of them tapped his earpiece, like suddenly he remembered there might be rules. The hallway, once humming with silent authority, grew cold with consequence. Franklin walked with purpose, his gaze never straying from the faces that had ignored his wife, detained her, and now stood trying to decide how much trouble they were in. A supervisor arrived, mid-40s, polite but pale. His badge said, "Operations Lead." He reached to shake Franklin's hand, but Franklin didn't take it. "Why was she pulled?" he asked. The supervisor blinked. "Sir, I'm still reviewing—" "Not good enough," Franklin said. She showed valid credentials. She checked in. She cooperated. "What justification did your staff have for singling her out and calling security?" The man stammered. "There was a seating issue. She was flagged for additional screening. I wasn't here." "So you're here now. Fix it." Jasmine stood to the side, watching it all unfold like she was watching someone else's movie. For the first time that morning, the pressure in her chest eased. Not because Franklin was fighting for her, but because he was making it clear that this wasn't about a personal slight. It was about respect, and how easily it gets stripped away when no one expects accountability. Another figure appeared, the gate manager. He wore a blazer that didn't quite fit and walked like someone already writing their apology in their head. "Judge Rhodes, Congresswoman Crockett," he said quickly, "we deeply regret the confusion." "Confusion?" Franklin interrupted. "She was treated like a security risk. She was questioned, delayed, ignored, and now she's missed a funeral. That's not confusion. That's a systemic failure in judgment." The man opened his mouth again, but Franklin stepped closer. "Tell me who made the call to escalate. Who flagged her?" "That's a personnel issue, sir." "No, that's a bias issue, one I'm now formally documenting, and I'm not asking again." Silence. Passengers were slowing in the hallway now, sensing something important was happening. Phones were being raised, faces turned. Jasmine caught a glimpse of one woman mouthing, "That's her. That's the judge." Franklin lowered his voice, but not his authority. "We're not here for free upgrades. We don't want your compensation. What we want is recognition. That she deserved better. That every person who's been treated like this deserves better." The TSA agents looked away. The gate staff stood frozen. "Because this time," Franklin said, his voice dropping, "you didn't get to hide behind anonymity. You got caught, and the next step will be public." Jasmine stepped beside him. Not behind him, beside. She looked at the supervisor. "Don't issue an apology because he's standing here. Issue it because you finally understand what you did." The man swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." Franklin turned to Jasmine, his hand resting lightly at her back. "Ready to go?" She nodded. "More than ready." They walked out together, through the same door she had entered alone just an hour earlier. But this time, she didn't feel dismissed. She felt seen. And the silence left behind in that hallway spoke louder than anything either of them could have said.